Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the expansion of universal lore. Now, what I mean by that is like when you take connected universes, whether it be the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the DCEU, the Arrowverse, etc. It's these established universes that are connected, obviously, but like what I mean is like when something happens in that universe, it expands in certain things. It expands the lore in that universe because it's such an interesting thing. Because obviously using like the DCEU and the MCU for as a prime example, because those universes move around time. Like in the DCEU, look at the Wonder Woman movies. They take place in the past. Obviously, like a lot of the current DCEU, obviously that's going to change as more and more of the DCEU comes out, especially because you look at the Batman movie that's going to come out later on. That's taking place in the past. But it's this interesting thing of like, yeah, this world is already established, but obviously you connect a lot of stuff to it, and you take the Wonder Woman stuff that that expands the lore because it expands the timeline. A great example of that would be using that same example in the MCU. Like obviously you have like initially like Captain America going the furthest back in time and stuff like that, being in the 1940s, but like this far into the MCU, we're 20 plus movies in, and then you take Captain Marvel, which goes back like 20 years from the current present of the MCU, like stuff like that, because it's expanding the lore, introducing this character who's technically existed in his universe this entire time that you just wasn't aware of. She's been around this entire time, and just like little clever like things like that I think is so interesting, because obviously I've always talked about like the amazingness that is these connected universes, because you can have like the awesome crossovers and stuff like that. Obviously because of the crossovers you can have stuff like Avengers happening, like all these different characters from these different movies, because it's all taking place within the same universe. And a great example, and this could apply to the the DCEU, or in particular is going heavily play a part in the MCU going forward, but it can also play a part in the Arrowverse, interestingly enough. It's a whole aspect of, even if things end in certain regards, that legacy is already established, and that's something you can pull from. Like using the Arrowverse, for example. Like obviously I've talked about it recently. Obviously Arrow is ending after the next season. The 8th season will be the final season. But the thing is, even when that's all said and done, depending on how the story plays out and stuff like that, that's still stuff the rest of the Arrowverse can pull from. So like even if Arrow ends, that doesn't mean that later on in the timeline they still can't bring back characters from the show of Arrow or stuff that Arrow set up at some point in its history that they could still meld into the continuity of the others. Because it's just, like I said, these are built upon each other in this interesting way. Because to give you an example of like expanded lore, it's like Arrow started off obviously as this very grounded show, but then you introduced The Flash, which became a spin-off. It introduced metahumans. And obviously in turn that has affected Arrow because metahumans have popped up. You take Dinah. Dinah literally became a metahuman because of the particle accelerator that exploded in Central City during The Flash. Obviously Barry himself, as well as other characters from The Flash, have come over into Arrow. Another example will be Black Siren. Laurel from Earth 2, the multiverse got established on The Flash, yet that character now is on Arrow playing a big role in everything. Even Vigilante, found out his whole situation. He's a metahuman too, like obviously with everything going on with Vince's story. But it's just an interesting thing. Like I said, the lore expands, because now like obviously like it's like, oh yeah, time travel is a much bigger thing, not just because of Barry, because the legends are all doing their own thing. Even using Supergirl, for example, that's taking place on a completely different Earth, and you get what I'm saying. But obviously this is me just focusing on like superhero TV shows, because like I said, like they've always been like the most like connected universes that I'm the most familiar with, obviously. But then like obviously there's another one that I've come to appreciate even more, and that is the Vampire Diaries universe. Like obviously that spanned across 3 different shows: the Vampire Diaries, the originals, and now Legacies. Which if you've never seen Legacies, you really should. It's really good. It does a very fantastic job of expanding the lore that's already established. Because if you're unaware, like with the Vampire Diaries, they basically set it up that there are only basically 3 supernatural creatures: vampires, werewolves, and witches. Obviously there's ghosts too, but as the series has progressed, they have introduced other aspects to that lore, because they introduced like obviously Cade, they introduced the Sirens. Silas ended up being kind of a thing from the past that ended up becoming a thing in the present day. Like I said, the lore is always expanding, because even using the originals themselves, like they obviously were like not a thing present day until it's like, oh no, they've always been a thing in this universe, and then they just pop up present day. It is stuff like that. But not even just there. The originals kept that whole aspect of technically there's only 3 supernatural creatures. Obviously they introduced like the Hollow and everything. And then you get to Legacies, which this is going to be kind of spoilers, but I'll try not to go too deep into it. But basically you end up finding out that a lot of myths and fairy tales that are based on like all these mythical creatures, technically those creatures did exist at one point in time, because obviously, like, you know, within every myth and fable there is a little bit of truth or whatever. Well, you end up finding out, like I said, I don't want to go too deep into it, but you find out like, oh yeah, like there's always been those creatures, just people don't remember for a particular reason. Like I said, I won't go into for spoiler reasons, but that was so cool to me, because like for so long in this universe, you thought it was like only these 3 main supernatural creatures, and it turned out like, nope, there is way more out there. And like the reasoning for making it like, oh, like the reason why you don't remember is this huge thing happened. And it's like, that's so cool. And you can only get something like that because of this connected universe. It's like, yeah, you know all this stuff here. Well, let's expand upon that lore to be even bigger than what it is, you know, and because it gives the show this fresh angle to it as well, just because it's like, you know, doing something almost new. And you know, obviously I've talked about it before, not just the tone of the show, but that aspect in itself is so amazing. So it's so interesting, like, you know, because like I said, I'm not that familiar with a lot of TV shows that do the connected universes. There's certain crime dramas like your Law and Orders and Chicago TV shows that do that, but still, like, and you know, I'm not talking about them just because I'm not well versed in them. I've brought that, you know, up before, but to me, that's an aspect of like connected universes I never really thought of a lot. Of just like the fact is that they expand the lore of other things, you know? Kind of even going back to like the Arrowverse situation. Like obviously it doesn't come up too much because it's more like kind of an Earth 38 situation with Supergirl, but obviously it establishes like, oh yeah, like aliens coming to Earth being a thing. Like obviously that had an effect on the Arrowverse during like the Heroes versus Alien crossover, because aliens attacked on Earth 1 and it got Supergirl's help. Like that's a whole thing, you know? So it's so interesting. Because giving another example of that would be like, obviously like going forward, you know, Batwoman is going to join that. So like all like this different, you know, you know, whether it be like Batman, Robin, Batgirl, like the Bat family, you know, lore mythology. Because at that point in time, like, you know, with where the Arrowverse is, it's like, you know, it's been shown that like obviously Batman has been an established thing, but like there's been references to him and stuff like that. But then in like, you know, to Oliver's thought and to a lot of people, it's like Batman isn't real. It's like it's a myth. But it's like now all that mythology that is connected to Batman is now lore implanted in the Arrowverse. So it's so interesting. Like I said, like that's another aspect that I never really took time to really appreciate about, you know, connected universes, that it expands the lore in very interesting ways, and it allows you to kind of, you know, reach out and do certain things that maybe you couldn't have done before because you've, you know, and I think that's a very ingenious way of kind of building upon a universe in that regard. So, you know, like I said, this isn't it's a new angle to a conversation I've already talked about countless times before, but I just kind of wanted to share that thought I had with you guys. And obviously it's not going to stop there, because all these particular universes, you know, for the foreseeable future are obviously continuing on. Using the MCU, for example, like things are kind of building out more. Like obviously with the DCEU, there's a whole situation of things going forward might not connect as much, but there might be some connections here and there. You know, that depends on how Warner Brothers handles the whole thing going forward. But definitely we'll see that a lot with the Arrowverse and the MCU in particular. And that's so fascinating to see like what the lore is going to look like going forward. Because a great example too will be like, I've talked about this before, magic isn't that big of a thing in the MCU. That's even a conversation I've had recently about like, oh, because most of the movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are sci-fi movies. You take Doctor Strange introduced magic. That means magic is a thing in the MCU. That means that's something we can tackle more. We can introduce more magical characters and stuff like that. Just because you've established magic as a thing that exists in that universe, has existed for a while, just most people didn't know about it. So that it's so amazing, and it just makes you kind of just like, it's just so cool, you know? So like I said, just something interesting that was in the back of my mind that I just kind of wanted to share with you guys. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.